guest lecture today by Dr. Ben Habib. He's from International Relations and he specializes in Northeast Asia and environmental politics. And Ben will introduce his topic for this week on South Korea.
Cheers.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Monica.
So we will have 1 hour of lecture, 10 minutes break, and then you'll have the question and answer time. Yes? Okay, great. Thank you.
Cool, thanks. Great to be back in the CIA class here. Despite its ominous coding, it is quite an enjoyable class to come and guest lecture in. This is, I think, the 6th or 7th year I've come and done a guestie in this class. In the past, I've come in and talked about North Korea, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today, although if you want to ask some questions about North Korea in the Q&A in the second half, by all means, we can do that. Today I want to talk about the Candlelight democracy movement and environmentalism in South Korea. So you may remember in 2016 and 2017 there was quite a large protest movement in South Korea that culminated in the impeachment of President Park Geun Hye, who now finds herself housed in a jail somewhere in South Korea. So this democracy movement is part of a larger story of social change and grassroots reaction to top-down politics in South Korea that's linked to broader global developments in terms of the sustainability transition. So the kind of analysis I'm going to do here is very much based on a complex systems view of the world. Are any of you familiar with complex systems? Some of you that have done my environmental politics classes in the past may have come across this. What do you think is entailed by this diagram here? It's like the Russian dolls kind of thing, yep? No. That's not what's being implied here.
Global, regional, and local or something?
Yeah, so there's different levels of action and different actors playing at those levels.
I was going to say they're all sort of interdependent.
Yeah, that's right. They're all, what happens at each level is linked to what happens at other levels. You can't separate what's happening at one level of analysis from what's happening elsewhere. So the very local, and this is a picture of the Han River in Sewol, is related to what's happening in the Korean Peninsula, Northeast Asia, globally and cosmically, if you want to go there. So this is very much a nested systems view. All actors are part of broader systems. So I don't know if you've heard of this concept of holons before. But it's like a scientific term that says any entity is itself a constituent part of larger systems, and itself is a body that has lots of subsystems within it. So the human body is a classic example of this. What kind of different systems exist within the human body to make it work? Yeah, cells, circulatory system, cardiovascular. You know, I'm shit at biology, so I can't remember what they're... But we know. There's lots of different subsystems in the human body, and our individual human bodies, we as individual people are part of lots of other different networks and systems and whatnot. So that kind of concept applies to any unit of analysis in politics. So this is the view I'm taking here. Everything's networked, everything is part of larger systems, and everything... behaviours and outcomes are governed by flows of different things through those systems. So if you're looking at what happens in a city day to day, what kind of flows come in and out of a city? Energy, definitely.
Goods, services, people.
Goods and services, traffic, water, people flows, all kinds of different things. So those things are important in determining, what happens at any given time. So now let's set the scene and look at the Candlelight democracy movement and the impeachment of Park Geun Hye. Does anyone remember seeing this on the news? Unfortunately, the sound is disabled, but it's quite impressive. 2 million people on the streets of Sewol. Can you imagine what 2 million people on the streets of Melbourne would look like? Yeah, it'd be extraordinary. So this is not the first time there's been large-scale democracy protests and mobilisations since the late 1970s in Korea, and this is the latest incarnation of this democratisation movement that's been going for a long time. And that democratisation movement came into being because of the authoritarian politics that existed in South Korea. And that authoritarian political system was underpinned by a very specific economic model, the Developmental State model, in which the government had a very cosy relationship with large industrial conglomerates and exercised a heavy hand in dictating what the outcomes of the economy would be. So if we have a look at why this protest movement was sparked, the trigger event was the behaviour of Park Geun Hye and some of the people surrounding her. So Park Geun Hye, what do we know about her? The former president of South Korea.
She was the daughter of the other authoritarian.
Park Geun Hye, yeah. So yeah, he was the authoritarian dictator for 25 years and the originator of this developmental state model. Yeah, Tanya.
So she was the first female president of South Korea. She got elected in, I think, around 2011, 2010, I think. Because it was, at the time she got impeached, it was by her third or fourth year at least.
Yeah.
And she got impeached, well, the diagram pretty much says it all, but
Yeah.
her connections to a personal friend and, yeah.
Yeah. So what do we know about this person, Choi Sung-sil? This was Park Geun Hye's good friend, going back a long way. Yeah.
She was the daughter of a leader of a cult, religious cult.
Yeah.
And the issue was that her connection with Park Geun Hye was considered too close, and to the extent that she not only wrote some of Park Geun Hye's speeches, but she used her position as a friend of the president to extract money from Samsung and Hyundai and as such. And so after the revelation that someone so close to furthermore, she also got access to secret files despite not having a government position as well.
Yeah, so all kinds of impropriety here. Channeling money from big companies through the government into a private slush fund for her and her family. Accessing classified documents related to national security. There were communiques coming out of the government in 2014 and 2015 saying that North Korea was on the brink of collapse and that South Korea and the international community should prepare for this. Now, there was no evidence for this on the ground, and yet this was coming from the Blue House, from right at the top. And it's because Che sort of fancied herself as a shaman and was divining that through whatever her shamanic methods were, that North Korea was on the brink of collapse, and was telling this to the president, and the president was trusting her, and this information was funneling directly into policy. So quite extraordinary level of access, like the modern-day Rasputin of South Korea. And then, of course, the links with the chaebol, and another story of people from elite families engaged in official corruption. This very cosy link between the government and the chaebol, the big conglomerates. That's an old story, and this is the latest chapter of corruption that people are getting sick of. So this is the diagram. Have a better read of it on the slides. So that was the trigger for these protests. But what's the context? People don't just get on the streets. 2 million people don't hit the streets because there was a corrupt politician. We know politicians are corrupt all the time. So What else is going on? Why is this impeachment? Why is this behaviour hitting such a nerve?
Of a ferry disaster?
Yes.
Or the triggers for the emotional response.
Yes, so the Sewol ferry disasters, sinking of the ferry, this ferry off the west coast. And the government's response was so inadequate to this disaster event. A level of paralysis and inaction that made the situation much worse. And Park's government rightly copped a lot of criticism for how it handled this event, and continues to take a lot of criticism even after the fact. So that's one thing. But I want to take this story back a little bit further. Some of you that have done Pol 2 CPA will have seen some of these pictures, so you know this story. But South Korea, if we look back, this is 100 years ago at the turn of the 20th century. This is what Sewol looked like then. It's a little fishing village on the north bank of the Han River. This is what it looks like during the Japanese occupation in the 1940s. So you can see already urbanisation, big change in the streetscape. So think about that change in architecture, that change in how the economy is structured, and think about all the changes in social relations that would have taken place to get from there to there. So, there's quite a rapid social change trajectory going on here. This is in the 1960s. This is just near Seoul Station in downtown Seoul. And this is the beginnings of building a big road network and subway stations. And then to Seoul, downtown Seoul, similar area, what it looks like today. What has to happen in a place, in a society, to get from there to there? Just throw some ideas around. What do you think? Yeah.
Coal.
Sorry?
Coal.
Coal?
Yeah.
Want to expand?
Lots of it.
In terms of in the energy mix?
Yes.
Yeah. So fossil fuels, this is not a fossil fuel society here. This very much is. And when you're a country that doesn't have any fossil fuels, by and large, you've got to import it from somewhere. So that's an important part of Korea's environmental story and foreign policy. Where does it source its energy? What else is important here? What else happens? Yeah.
Hard work.
Yeah. So hold that thought, because hard work's going to come up again in a minute. Yeah.
Cultural changes?
Yeah. So what kind of cultural changes did we see over this period?
Introduction of new people and new needs and desires and stuff. So
Yeah, and lots of different influences from outside over this period. So at this time, the Japanese are in charge. Korea is a colonial possession of the Japanese Empire. And so there's a lot of Japanese cultural influence coming in at the same time as the Japanese are trying to stamp out a lot of Korea's indigenous culture. Then we get to this time, what are the foreign influences coming into Korea post-World War II?
it's obviously open to trade.
Mhm.
A lot of foreign trade and investment.
Yeah, so, and who's the chief architect? What country? It's important here.
US.
Yeah, so the United States. Essentially, the US has occupied South Korea over that time. At its height, there's been 100,000 American troops in South Korea. Now it's down to about 20,000, give or take. But the penetration of American culture into the South is very strong. Just as an aside, you can see that when you compare Korean language in the North, in the South, there's a lot of new Korean words that are almost direct imports from English because of the American influence. In North Korea, those words are not in usage, obviously, because there was no American influence on that language. So that's an interesting illustration. Anything else happen to get from there to there?
Industrialization.
Yeah. So this is very much a peasant agricultural or fishing society. This heavy industrialization. So if you imagine you were born here and now you're in your 90s here, what have you seen in your personal life? What have you experienced? This is engaging in a little bit of empathic thinking here.
Lots of coups.
Yeah. So the political change over this time has been quite extreme. So change, rapid change, really important point. Now, obviously, we go back here, standards of living were very low, and even after the Korean War, so this is taken in the 1950s, this is a picture of some orphans in Busan. Now, why was the standard of living low in about 1955 in South Korea?
Well, because the Japanese had sort of left around that time, and they basically used Korea as a cash cow.
Yeah, so there'd been an extractive pattern, for sure. And something happened a bit after that as well. It's kind of important.
The Civil War.
Yeah, so the Korean War happened. Almost all of the peninsula got flattened, apart from a little portion, the Busan perimeter, down in the southeast corner. And so South Korea is very much a lowly developed country in the 1950s. In fact, North Korea is doing much better at that time. And there's a great deal of poverty. So part of this developmental state model, when Park Geun Hye comes to power in 1960, is they want to bring South Korea out of endemic poverty and raise people's standards of living. And you cannot blame the governments of any country for prioritising raising standards of living when you're coming from that kind of base. So it's a really important point. And then we get to here, where it's very much South Korea now, particularly in the big cities, very much first world standards of living. Monica will give 5% extra marks on the quiz this week for anyone who does the Gangnam Style dance right now. I just made that up. Monica's not going to do that. All right, so let's have a look quickly at the developmental state. Now, I don't usually like to put big slabs of writing on a slide, but I think a definition is important here. And this is from a book by a friend of mine from UNSW, Liz Turbin, and her colleague, Mr. Kim, whose full name escapes me. And they say, specifically, developmentalism embodies an inherently political view of the economy. In the eyes of policymakers, the purpose of economic activity is to promote national security and prestige in what's perceived to be an inherently competitive and hostile environment. The goal of industrial governance is therefore to promote local manufacturing capacity, technological autonomy, export competitiveness for nation building and nation sustaining purposes. For this reason, amongst the policy-making elite, the practice of strategically intervening in the economy in pursuit of these goals is accepted as both necessary and desirable. Now, I've highlighted the bits in bold because they're really important here. So this describes how economic development is raised to this almost cult-like devotion within South Korea. This is not something to be criticised. You criticise the developmental state, you're a communist. And being regarded as any way right-wing in South Korea, particularly during the Cold War, could get you sent to jail or beaten up by the police, or perhaps something worse. And the national security law was put in place in order to administer that kind of thing. But pertinent to Park's impeachment is this practice of strategically intervening in the economy, because that practice is ripe for becoming corrupt practice. It's ripe for government officials cultivating cosy relationships with the industrial sector. So this model, well, it's been kind of successful, yeah? Got us from there to here. Raise people's standards of living, but there's costs. There's big social costs to this model. This is Park Geun Hye here, Park Geun Hye's dad. And these are some of the the chaebols that, brands, big brands now, international brands that we're very familiar with here in Australia. And I think Samsung is the largest of the chaebol conglomerates. All right, any questions so far? It's all right. Yeah.
What is the translation of chaebol?
I don't know what the direct translation is, but it refers to those industrial conglomerates. So that collectively, that's what they're called. It's like the plural and the singular as well. All right, so the developmental state model was not cost-free. What have been the social impacts? Yeah, Ron?
Massive exploitation of labour throughout the years.
Yeah, you know what I'm going to say because you've seen this story before. Anyone who hasn't done Pol 2 CPA, what do you think are the next parts of this story? What are some of the social impacts?
Some environmental impacts, I think.
Yes, yeah.
Long work hours, stressful long education and work hours.
Yeah. Have you been to Korea or Japan?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you know what I'm about to talk about. All right, so we talked about this rapid, large-scale social change. And it's difficult to understand the social and cultural impact of rapid change unless you've lived through it. I mean, think about the changes that we've seen in Australia since 1900. What's gone on in Korea has been of a larger scale and much more rapid and compressed than what we've seen here. And that has social and political consequences. This is a bit of graffiti that I photographed in Sinchon subway station back in 2008 when I was a PhD student doing research in Sewol. And I thought it was very poignant at the time. Is this something that that resonates with you? Yeah, I'm seeing nods. Want to expand on it?
Just that obviously everything has to change, but sometimes it can serve to either adjust to new things or be less comfortable to sacrifice one thing to something else. Yeah.
So it's an important point. Cultures and societies are always changing. They're always in dynamic flux. So you can't just keep things in one place. That's not how life works. But really fast change can outstrip the ability of people and communities to adapt to that kind of change without really serious disruption. So that's what I'm getting at here. All right, the window of opportunity for the horse dance is still open if anyone wants that 5%.
Can you put the music on if you can?
Oh, I could. But I'm not going to. Everyone knows the song. You can picture it in your mind. Gangnam Style. Why am I putting Gangnam Style up here and Psy? Important bit of social commentary, Liam.
I would say it's taking a very critical look at the sort of on the very indulgent sort of context for business people and also the working people, and kind of that focus on people's priorities being skewed.
Yeah. So there's a class and inequality critique in what Psy's saying. Now, Psy is obviously not a sociologist, but often art can be a very powerful vehicle for making important social commentary. And particularly in a more conservative society like Korea, it was quite important what he's come out and said here. So the significance of Gangnam. Gangnam means south of the river. So this is a suburb of Seoul on the south bank of the Han River. This was the first area of expansion during the 1960s when the city of Seoul started to expand and develop new residential areas. Now it's become the financial heart of South Korea. So something like 9 or 10% of the country's GDP comes just out of Gangnam. There's buildings, Samsung's headquarters are there. A number of the other chaebol headquarters are there. And of course, what kind of culture are you likely to see in a place like this? Sorry?
Affluent.
Yeah. Yes, there's very highbrow, high class. There's a bit of nouveau riche snobbery that comes in here, and this is what Psy is taking the piss out of in Gangnam Style. He's having a crack at the Gangnam guy, which is an interesting take. In the horse dance, I can't remember the exact translation. Have a look at this link here. There's a really interesting article from The Atlantic that deconstructs the themes in the song. Monica's got the PDF of these slides, so they'll be on LMS. Are they on there already? Yeah. So if you want to follow the slides, they're already up. But yeah, the horse dance relates to something like, I can't remember what it means, but it translates to getting loose, blowing off steam, having a big night. Which is important if you've been working hard for the first 18 years of your life, working very long hours a day. So how long was your school day? Like, think back to primary school and high school. How many hours were you in school? Okay, yeah, 6 or 7 hours. Imagine if you had to do 2, 3, 4 hours of cram school tutoring in the morning and in the evening, before and after that 6-hour day. So how would your energy levels be by the end of the school year? Right. How would your social development be by the time you're 16, 17, 18? Yeah, not quite as advanced because you haven't had the chance to socialise and do other things. Any other impacts that this kind of educational model might have? Yeah. Yeah. High pressure, because all of these students are working towards the final college entrance exam so that they can get a good mark, so that they can get entry into the big universities in order to get a job in one of the chaebols. So this is like the traditional arc of social mobility and employment. So there's very high pressure to perform, hence the cram school. Yep.
I'm not sure if those cram schools are expensive or not, but those that can't afford it, are they just doing that behind?
Yeah, they can be. So there's a level of social exclusion there if you can't go through that system. And you want to go to the big universities because then there's cultural cachet that helps you in the workforce and network building, and so there's a perception that a person's future is heavily tied on this exam. So massive stress in here. So imagine having that looming over your head, and you're tired as hell because you've been working 12 hours a day for your whole child life. This isn't it, and it's a lot of the type of learning you do here is much more rote learning than what would be elsewhere. So personally, I'm very, very critical of this education model. But it served its purpose. Yeah, Ron?
But I was going to ask, with this education sort of cultural system embedded there, do you reckon it kind of forces this sort of feeling of compliance? And
Yes.
like you said, hierarchy, and that sort of eliminates the possibility down the track of developing these social skills and enhancing civil society in that sense? Like there's no room for other extra activities that, it's just all about my group and no one else. It's like, I'm going to focus on myself, not care about any other issues but my own well-being.
Yeah, it's very insular. It's very insulating. And not necessarily because you don't want to care about other issues. You don't have the space. You don't have the mental space or the time. And the militarization of South Korean society. So this is in the context of the inter-Korean clash. All men have to do military service, and females can if they want to, for a couple of years at the end of high school or after college. And the society is very much organised in this martial military way, and particularly in educational institutions and in the workplace. So there's all of these constraints and pressures that make this a really difficult institution to be a part of. Now, I'm not saying that Australia's education institutions are fully awesome or anything like that, because clearly we've got big issues in our education system as well. But there's some specific critiques of this particular system that I think are very, very pertinent. And they're pertinent to the topic that we're talking about here. One of the issues that people of your generations are facing now, and there's a bit of a similarity here, is employment prospects. This is a job fair in Sewol from a couple of years ago. And obviously there's bigger population density and larger population in South Korea, so this kind of event is well populated. But young people are finding it pretty hard to get a job. And when you have a highly educated workforce, young people have expectations and a culture that very much values climbing that ladder. If you can't climb that ladder, then what's that doing to the people that are missing out? Any thoughts?
There's no safety net, there's no other sort of prospect or option. They just fall out of the system kind of thing.
Yeah, and if you're not in the system, there's something wrong with you, right? That can be the view. Sorry, excuse me for pointing. That was quite aggressive. But you get the gist of what I'm saying here. The work culture and stress. So that very stultified and stressful educational environment is also reflected in the workplace. So long hours. Then after work, you'll probably be asked to go out drinking with your immediate work team for a few hours after that, some of the nights a week. And you might come home absolutely hammered at 11 o'clock at night, and then you've got to front up to work the next morning. So there is quite if you go to a 7-Eleven or a equivalent convenience store in South Korea, there's a whole range of energy drinks specifically designed to cure hangovers, which is an awesome discovery when you're travelling there. But it's interesting that these products exist because there's a market for them, because there's this kind of culture there. Also in the hierarchies of these organisations, there's very little personal autonomy. There's significant issues with gender empowerment, or disempowerment, I should say. So these are quite hostile institutions for people to be a part of. Again, these are not people-friendly environments. And the stress associated with this leaches out in lots of interesting ways, including through alcoholism. Now, Australians drink pretty hard. Why do you think people in Australia, why has Australia got the drinking culture that it has? What are some of the underlying reasons why people like to drink here, apart from enjoyment?
The social interaction. You go to a bar, you have a time with your mates over a beer or two. So there's a sense of it's a social activity in Australia for drinking culture. But for South Korea, there is a bit of a social activity, but it's also related to stress as well as mental health as well.
Yeah.
Is Australia on that? I can't see it there.
No, I don't think so.
Do you know whereabouts it lies?
I'm sure you could locate yourselves on here somewhere. Yeah. Now, of course, there could be questions about the methodology of this, but just the trend there tells you something interesting about the alcoholism here. Now, of course, I've participated in this. This is from 2002. I don't remember how that night ended. I really don't. But these guys are from the basketball team that I joined. And prior to this night, it was all, our interactions were all, very formal. After this night, best buddies, because, it's an important bonding ritual. Even more so than it is here, I think. And it's quite a specific formal way of drinking there. And it's a way of building trust. So this is one of the reasons why work teams are encouraged to go out and drink, because it's a way of trust building. in the workplace. But it's quite a costly way of trust building because it's self-destructive. And there's a very high element, I suggest, of escapism in this, and people looking to blow off steam and release stress. Now, what do you think are some of the impacts of alcoholism? If you're doing this to blow off steam in such a profound way, what's going to be the follow-on effects? Lynn?
Violence in the home.
Yep, that could be one. Sorry? Yeah, definitely.
Health issues?
Yeah. So there's going to be a cost for the health infrastructure for sure. It could be law and order issues. Now, South Korea is not a violent place. I feel much, much safer in Seoul than I do in Melbourne. However, drunk people do silly things. Someone has to clean up all the spew on the ground outside of the karaoke parlours. That's a cost. Even little things like that. Cleaning up is a cost. So yeah, domestic violence is an issue in Korea. And because of the Confucian culture there, it's something that's very difficult to talk about. Like, it's a difficult subject to talk about in Australia, but even more so in South Korea. This is a photo of a domestic violence victims advocacy group in Gyeongsang province who are trying to raise awareness on this issue and provide support for survivors of domestic violence. But again, very difficult within the legal system and the police for victims to come and get their story taken seriously, because it's considered as something that's in the home. It's not for the public to deal with. So there's a lot of silence here. Suicide rates were mentioned. The suicide rates in South Korea are very high. And when you understand the kind of pressures to succeed that the dominant culture puts out there, along with the suffocation of the institutions in which people are expected to progress through to succeed, like this, I don't think this kind of statistic is much of a surprise. It's very sobering, but there's an issue here. Which leads me then to talk about the environmental impacts of this developmental state model. So this is the X factor. This ties in my story. And it's important because when you live in a place like South Korea, high population density and concentrations of people. So when there's environmental problems, it's very noticeable and it impacts people on a very visceral level. You can't hide from it. And one of those things you can't hide from is air pollution. So this is a map of air pollution hotspots across the country. Is there anything you notice there?
Something's going on the 153 side on the west side, up the top.
Up here?
Or the 153 that's isolated by itself, in the middle of an island somewhere.
That would be a military outpost.
Wow.
Yeah. Concentrations around the greater Seoul area here. So obviously there's a lot of people in that area. There's a lot of vehicular traffic and there's a lot of industrial activity. There's car manufacturing down here. The American air bases are in here, so they have a big environmental footprint. There's large industrial centres down here, including Hyundai factories and the Pohang steel mills. So air pollution's an issue. But the worst statistics are up here where most of the people live. So that pollution is directly impacting on the quality of life of the people that live there, directly impacting on their lived experience. So becomes a political problem. Water pollution is an issue. See if we can get... This was the Han River in Seoul back in the 60s, so you could swim in there and have a good time very safely. It was a beautiful place to be. And you can imagine this river, when you go upstream and see what the Han River looks like outside of the city, it's absolutely spectacular. It's beautiful. But now, while this is beautiful in its own unique way, the banks of the river have been completely covered in concrete. Freeways have been built along there. And obviously if you're building freeways, you're looking for a path of least resistance to build them. So on the riverbank, this is a convenient place to locate these things, to facilitate traffic. But that's had a significant impact on the water quality and the viability of the marine ecosystem in the Han River. This is a picture of back in the Lee Myung-bak administration around 2010-2011. There was a proposal for the Four Rivers project, which wanted to build a series of dams along 4 of the major rivers in Korea, and also do a lot of development activity along these rivers. Now, it was ultimately defeated because the environmental impact of these proposals was going to be really high. But again, that case illustrates this tension between the desire for economic development and the privileging of development by policymakers well above any other consideration. That's something that that's a cultural tendency within the elite that's going to be very hard to break. It is happening, but old habits die hard. Deforestation is an issue. So this is a topographical map of the Korean Peninsula. Obviously, you can see it's very mountainous, and those mountainous areas are home to some really beautiful forests. But with the urban expansion of cities, a lot of those forests are also prime real estate for the building of apartment complexes and whatnot. So some of those forests are being felled. We had the Pyeongchang Olympics recently. This is the course for the ski run, the downhill ski run. So we all saw footage of the downhill ski run. This is also one of the forest of one of the rarest yew trees on the planet in the Mount Gariwang area. So this is an endangered forest, quite old, but that was cleared away for the development of the Olympic site, and there were protests around this. But obviously the Olympics have been and gone, the thing was built, and another little bit of natural ecosystems in Korea was chipped away. Are there any examples like this in Australia you can think of where ecosystems were deemed, development was deemed more important than preserving ecosystem? Yeah.
Sort of current arguments going on over the Adani Line and the Great Barrier Reef.
Yeah.
And even people in the area saying it's okay to destroy our natural area because we need the jobs, the jobs out here. But then also people saying, well, you can't destroy the Great Barrier Reef. It might have these environmental impacts that we can't reverse.
Yeah. So this is not a South Korea problem. This is an everywhere problem related to industrial development. Any other examples here?
Well, in Victoria yesterday, I think in the budget meeting, not central, but the Great National Forest, I think down where the Ledbetter Fossil is in Victoria, wasn't supported or opened up to more, or changed what it is in terms of its, how it's done.
Pretty much this is the story of development. Where we are here, it was not always a university, obviously. There was virgin land here. And someone deemed it fit that this land could be used for something else, for human activity. So that's the trade-off. But if you keep doing that, if you keep sacrificing ecosystems for development, eventually you don't have any ecosystems. And then we discover that those ecosystems actually perform really important functions in terms of regulating the health of the planet, the atmosphere, the water cycle, the carbon cycle, nitrogen and nutrient cycles in the soil. So you can't just keep chipping away at ecosystem, because that comes back and impacts us and all other species directly. So when we talk about existing within nested systems, the development model that's been developed in Korea and elsewhere, the industrial model sees humans as separate from the natural world, which is clearly not the case. We're interdependent parts of these complex systems. And when we mess with them, we're messing with ourselves. Climate change vulnerability, like everywhere else, South Korea has got an issue with climate change. It's messing with the precipitation regime in South Korea. So rainfall intensity can go up. So what we see with the East Asian monsoon in Korea, it rains more in the summer. It's wetter in the summer. So during that period, instead of having consistent heavy rains over the monsoon period, the documented trend over the last 10 or 15 years is to have more like big storm, big rain dumping events that are intermittent rather than steady rains, which increases flood risk and erosion risk. It's public health issues, obviously the extreme weather events, and the impact on infrastructure and human environments as well as ecosystems is a problem. If you're interested in this stuff, there's plenty of organisations that do climate vulnerability research. So you'd be forgiven for thinking I've painted quite a bleak picture here. And I do this as someone who goes to South Korea all the time and loves the place. It's a really wonderful country to go to. But as an outsider, I also, when you visit a place, you have this view, because you're a little bit separated from the local culture and society, where you can see patterns and see things that are more difficult for local people to acknowledge or to see, although clearly lots of people are making this link here. So the picture I've painted is that this protest movement, the Candlelight democracy movement, was about much more than Park Geun Hye. Yes, it was about political corruption, but that's a story that people have been angry about for a long time. Yes, there's social problems that have been created by the economic development model. There's been cultural issues that are related to this. Economic disempowerment for the people that don't end up being included in this model, and the environmental degradation that is caused. So, what's the menu of political choice available for people at the grassroots to respond? What do you think? You live in this society. What can you do about that? What are your options? And in answering that question for Korea, you can think about what's your menu of choice for you here in responding to the numerous issues that we've got in our society.
Well, you can vote, I guess.
Yeah. So using the political institutions the way they're meant to be used. Yeah. Anything else?
You take to the streets,
It's a protest. Yeah. Liam?
Student groups in universities.
Yep. Yep, so linking up with other people, that's really important. Power of networks and acting collectively is really important. Well, let's have a look. And again, think about how this resonates with your lived experience. Now, one of the good reasons to study other societies and other cultures is it gives you a window to reflect back on yourself and your culture and your experience. So keep that in mind as we go through this. But option one is to just knuckle down and play the game. There's not much I can do about it. These are big systems and big structures. I'm just going to dig in and do the best I can. Be part of the rat race. What's the consequence of this strategy, do you think, for the people who adopt it?
You can burn out, lose your individual self, and just waste your life a little bit.
Yeah, you've got to accept the burdens of that choice. In fact, with any of these things, you've got to accept the burdens of your choice. There are pros and cons to each of these. Anything else we could say about this one?
You have to fit into a mould that may not necessarily fit your talents and that sort of thing, so there's more personal consequences necessarily than you may not be good at playing the game.
Yeah. Some of us are familiar with what that feels like. Now, I should say, obviously this is quite a pejorative picture I've put up here of the rats in the rat race. All of us will do this. All of us will do this. Because in a sense we have to. So we can't get too nasty. It's, okay, what do we do within the circumstances that we've found? Option number 2 is, okay, we're part of this system. How can we work within the bounds of this system to create positive change? So the example I've got here, this is the Changhaechun stream, which goes right from central Seoul and sort of winds its way around to the Han River. Now this is what it looked like 30 or 40 years ago. There was a freeway built over the top of it. This was a drain, sort of a little stream that did exist prior to the developed period, but it got paved over for this freeway and then became a bit of a dump site underneath the overpass here. So Lee Myung-bak, the president, but before he was president, he was mayor of Seoul. And under his term there, he oversaw the deconstruction of this freeway and the turning of this space, bioremediating the stream and turning it into a biodiversity corridor. And now it's one of the most beautiful places that you can find in the middle of Seoul. A wonderful place to walk down. Are there any other examples of creating positive change within the system? Yeah.
I don't know about if this is relevant, but I've heard recently that Singapore is quite good at trying to reforest their urban environments.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot of advocacy work to be done, with governments and other organisations to try and create positive change. You can vote. So if you live in a liberal democracy, and South Korea is an aspiring liberal democracy, it's made massive strides in that sense, but it still has work to do, like all democracies do. So you can vote as part of the political process. You can do work within your workplace to try and engage with your organisation and the higher-ups to do things. Of course, what happens when you're in a work environment where people at the bottom are encouraged not to say anything, just to do their jobs?
Yeah, systems like the banking system, where you've got a lot of corruption and greed happening at the upper levels and a lot of rules.
Yeah. So big hierarchy is not very friendly to this kind of creating positive change from within model. So bear that in mind if you want to go work for the public service here or a big company or anything like that, is that your power at the bottom is quite small within the organisation. Now option number 3 is you might say, okay, within the system, it doesn't work too well, I'm going to step outside and do more traditional activist stuff. So this is a picture from our Environment and Sustainability and Career Study Tour from last year. Some of you are in the picture. Liz, Liam. But this is a woman called Junie Kim. Now she's been an environmental activist for 30 years. When she was at university, she was part of the pro-democracy movement in the 1980s. And a lot of the people, the environmentalists of a baby boomer age, were a part of that generation in Korea, and then they've carried on their social justice activism in the environmental space. And they're now mentoring and shepherding through a new generation of people through the Candlelight democracy movement. But she was there. She was one of those 2 million people in the streets of Seoul every Saturday. They'd all gather there and protest, and they did that for a year. So activism is one outlet, protest. Are there any limitations to that model as a political strategy?
It takes a lot of voices to be heard.
Yeah, so you really need the power of numbers. There's 2 million people, clearly that worked because they got their immediate goal of the impeachment of Park. Are there any other drawbacks to traditional activism?
Don't quite have the lobbying type power that big corporate giants have.
Yeah, so there's a power imbalance, which is why you need lots of people in order to redress that. But if you're just saying no to things without offering an alternative, then that can be disempowering as well, because you're pumping a lot of energy into opposing something rather than as well as presenting an alternative. So it has its place, but it could be an incomplete strategy. Option number 4 would be to create some alternatives. Now, in a system like South Korea, where the state has its tentacles into all parts of the economy, if you want to do something different, you have to set up something outside of the state. And there's lots of examples of that here. The story of the organic agriculture movement in South Korea is really interesting. And one of the outgrowths of that is the Hansalim Organic Food Cooperative, which is the biggest organic food co-op in the world. And these are some of the statistics. So 500,000 households are buying food from Hansalim. Farmers and farming communities, if you're a food producer, you get to sell stuff at a fair price and you get some protection from market fluctuations. And it's directly connecting consumers with producers in a way where if you're buying from, say here, from Coles and Woolies, you're completely disconnected from where your food is coming from. So this is one example, but there's lots of other examples. The new economy movement, sharing economy practices. There's lots of new ways of doing things. Lots of new modes of production, consumption and exchange that are being developed at grassroots. And that's not just something that's happening in South Korea, that's happening everywhere in the world at the moment. The new isms of the next 200 years are being developed now, which is exciting because we can be part of shaping them. The other option available to you is if you don't like how the society's run, you can leave. And so there are an increasing number of young professional South Koreans who are going overseas, including to Australia, to find a place where they can have a better quality of life. So a consequence of that is if you get your best and brightest leaving, that creates a talent brain drain vacuum back home. Now, obviously there's lots and lots of smart and talented people in South Korea that are there to step into the void, but it is a problem when your country invests in educating people and then other places reap the benefits of that investment. So that can be counted as a cost, a social and economic cost. So I talked about the next isms of the next 200 years are developing right now. There's a global context that links all of this stuff together as well, that has an impact here, and that's the sustainability transition. The structure of the global economy is starting to change as the energy systems we use to power it are starting to change. So political power is very strongly related to the energy systems that power the society and who is in charge of them. Who gets to distribute that energy, who profits from it, who's the gatekeeper. So think of the fossil fuel economy, think of the economy of oil and who profits from that and how that's distributed and how that plays such a big role in the international relations of our society today and through the 20th century, through the oil era. Now think about how that system is changing, or how that system will change if you get energy from renewable energy technologies that are decentralized. So there's no gatekeeper. So every building has solar panels or wind power, a wind turbine on it. This is really important. The structure of the political economy of the world is changing because of these energy systems. We also know from the level of global environmental degradation that we do need to change how we're doing things. We need to change how our economy functions. We need to change the political relationships, the culture that underpins this system, and the technologies that we use. All of this, going from here to here, is part of sustainability transition. So this is a massive transition phase we're in right now. This is a level of change that is the same level of scale as the Industrial Revolution was 200 years ago. So that shapes all politics. Think of the political upheavals we've had here in Australia with leadership changes since 2007. Each of those leadership changes, one way or another, can be connected back to climate policy and part of this transition thing. Every political upheaval in the world at the moment, in one way or another, has roots in this transition phase that we're in. So the Candlelight democracy movement is also part of this. It's part of the stresses of the old system breaking down and this new one starting to bubble up. So on that note, I'm going to wind up, and I'm sure that's provided lots of food for thought for questions, and we'll get on to that after a short break. So thanks.